Do you remember me, cowboy? I was your childhood love come to our place tonight. Wild West story. The day had been long, filled with dust, hoarse sweat, and quiet work that kept his hands busy and his thoughts away. That was how he liked it. Thinking too much in this land usually led to trouble. He untied his boots slowly, poured a little water into a tin cup, and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the town settled into its usual evening silence, broken only by the creak of wood and distant footsteps. He was about to lie down when he noticed something slipped under the door. At first, he thought it was a receipt or an old notice. People often pushed unwanted papers into rooms by mistake, but this paper was folded carefully, almost respectfully. He frowned and reached down, picking it up between two fingers. The paper felt different, thicker, older, as if it had been waiting a long time to be touched. He unfolded it slowly. The writing stopped his breath. The letters were uneven, written by hand, and yet painfully familiar. He hadn't seen that handwriting in more than 30 years, but something deep inside him recognized it instantly. His chest tightened before his mind fully understood what his eyes were seeing. The message was short. Do you remember me, cowboy? I was your childhood love, come to our place tonight. That was all, no signature, no explanation. His fingers trembled as he read it again and then again. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. He stood up, pacing once, then stopping as if his legs no longer trusted him. Our place. Those two words echoed louder than the rest. There was no our place. Not anymore. There hadn't been one for decades. He moved to the small window and stared out at the darkening street. His reflection in the glass showed a man older than he felt. Lined face, tired eyes, shoulders shaped by years of work and loss. This wasn't the boy who once ran barefoot through tall grass. This wasn't the boy who had promised forever without knowing what forever cost. Slowly, memories he had buried began to rise. He remembered a small house at the edge of the prairie. It wasn't much, just wooden walls, a leaning fence, and a porch that creaked with every step. But to two children, it was the whole world. That place had smelled of dry earth, warm bread, and summer wind. It had been filled with laughter, whispered dreams, and the kind of happiness that doesn't know it's fragile. She had lived there, the girl from the letter. He remembered her laugh first. Light, fearless, the kind that carried across fields. She used to sit on the fence, swinging her legs, teasing him for being too serious even as a child. She called him Cowboy long before he ever became one. She said he looked like someone who belonged on a horse, someone meant to ride far away. Back then, he had promised he never would. The promise had not lasted. His jaw tightened as he folded the letter and unfolded it again, as if the words might change. But they didn't. They stayed sharp and impossible. She couldn't be writing to him, she shouldn't even know where he was. And the place she mentioned, it was gone. Burned, destroyed. Left behind like so many things in that harsh land. He remembered the night it happened. He had been young, scared, and powerless. There had been shouting, horses, men with anger in their voices. Land disputes, they called it later. Greed dressed up as law. By morning, the house was nothing but blackened wood and smoke. By the next day, he was gone. He had told himself leaving was the only way to survive. But survival had come with a cost. For years, he had wondered what happened to her. Sometimes he imagined she moved on, married, built a better life far from that painful place. Other times, darker thoughts followed him on lonely nights. He never searched, he never asked. He told himself it was better not to know. Now knowing was knocking at his door. He sat down heavily on the bed, the letter resting in his palm like a weight. His mind argued with itself. This could be a cruel trick. Someone could be playing with his past, trying to scare or confuse him. Or worse, it could be real. If it was real, then she had waited. The idea shook him. He stood again and walked to the small mirror nailed to the wall. He barely recognized the man staring back. Could she recognize him? Would she even want to? Time had not been kind to either of them, he was sure. Outside, the sky darkened fully, stars beginning to appear. Night in the west was honest and unforgiving. There was no hiding from yourself once the sun went down. He thought of tearing the letter apart. He didn't. Instead, he folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, right over his heart. His hands moved without his permission, guided by something older than fear. The horse waited outside, tied to the post where he had left it earlier. The animal lifted its head as he approached, sensing his unease. He rested his forehead briefly against the horse's neck, breathing in the familiar smell, grounding himself. "Just a look," he whispered to no one. "That's all." The ride out of town was quiet. The moon rose higher, lighting the dirt path ahead. Each step of the horse felt heavier, as if the past itself was pulling him forward. Every tree, every shadow stirred memories he thought he had forgotten. As he neared the edge of the prairie, his heart began to race. This land hadn't changed much. The wind still moved the grass the same way. The stars still watched silently from above. But he had changed. And so had she, whoever she was now. In the distance, he thought he saw a light. His breath caught. There shouldn't have been one. He slowed the horse, unsure whether to continue. Fear and hope twisted together inside him, impossible to separate. Turning back would be easier. Safer, but some doors, once opened, refused to close. He pressed forward. The light remained, steady and real, and with every step closer, he understood something he had avoided his entire life. The past does not stay buried just because you walk away. Sometimes it waits. The horse slowed as the land opened wide before him. The light he had seen earlier now stood clearly ahead, small but steady, glowing like a quiet promise in the dark. His heart beat harder with every step forward. He had not been back here in more than 30 years, yet his body remembered the way before his mind did. The curve of the path, the rise of the ground, even the way the wind shifted near the old trees felt familiar. He stopped the horse and listened. The night was calm. Crickets sang softly, and the grass moved like a gentle wave under the moonlight. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He swallowed and guided the horse forward again. As he rode, memories pressed in around him, not all at once but slowly, like pages turning in an old book. He remembered being a boy with dust on his hands and hope in his chest. Life had been hard even then, but it had been simple. Days were filled with work, but evenings belonged to dreams. He and the girl would sit on the porch steps, watching the sky change colors. She would talk about places beyond the prairie, about towns with music and streets full of people. He would listen quietly, pretending he didn't care, even though he did. She believed in tomorrow. He believed in staying. He remembered the way she looked at him when he said he would never leave, not with doubt but with trust. That look stayed with him longer than anything else. The horse stopped again, pulling him back to the present. He was close now, too close to turn back without knowing the truth. The place stood before him, half hidden by shadow and moonlight. At first glance, it looked nothing like the house he remembered. The old wooden home had been small and fragile, built with hope more than skill. This structure was different, still modest but stronger. The walls were worn, the roof slightly bent with age, but it stood firm, like someone who had survived many storms. A lantern hung by the door. That was the light. His chest tightened. Someone lived here. Someone had built a life on the same land that once held his childhood. He dismounted slowly, tying the horse to a nearby post. His hands shook as his boots touched the ground. Every step toward the house felt like stepping deeper into a memory he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He stopped a few feet from the door. The silence pressed in on him again. He raised his hand, intending to knock, but froze. What if no one answered? What if the letter had been a mistake, or worse, a cruel joke? What if opening this door meant opening wounds that never truly healed? Before he could decide, the door opened. She stood there holding the lantern. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She was not the girl he remembered, but she was not a stranger either. Time had changed her face, softening some lines, deepening others. Her hair, once loose and wild, was pulled back neatly, touched with silver. Her eyes, however, were the same, calm, steady, full of things left unsaid. She looked at him as if she had known exactly when he would arrive. "You came," she said quietly. Her voice was lower than he remembered, but it carried the same warmth. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words failed him. He nodded instead. She stepped aside, allowing him in. The inside of the house was simple, clean, warm. A small table near the window, a few chairs, shelves with carefully placed items that spoke of years lived slowly and with care. It did not feel like a place built overnight. It felt earned. "You can sit," she said, placing the lantern on the table. He sat, his back stiff, unsure where to rest his hands. She took a seat across from him. The lantern light flickered between them, casting moving shadows on the walls. For a long moment they just looked at each other. "I wasn't sure you would come," she said at last. "I wasn't sure I should," he replied honestly. She gave a small smile. "You never liked the hard choices." He let out a quiet breath, something close to a laugh. "Some things don't change." "No," she agreed. "Some things don't." Silence returned, but it felt different now. Less heavy, more thoughtful. "You thought this place was gone," she said gently, as if reading his mind. "I saw it burn," he answered. "I saw everything fall apart." She nodded. "It did for a long time." He looked around. "Then how?" "I stayed," she said simply. "I left for a while, but I came back. This land was all I had left of home." Her words carried no blame, just truth. "I didn't know," he said, his voice rough. "I thought it was better not to ask." She studied him carefully. "Was it?" He had no answer. She stood and poured water into 2 cups, handing one to him. Their fingers brushed briefly, and both pulled back, startled by the small contact. Years disappeared in that instant, replaced by something raw and real. "You wrote the letter," he said, stating what they both already knew. "Yes." "How did you find me?" She hesitated, then said, "People talk, and I never stopped listening." That sentence carried more weight than it seemed. He understood then that while he had been riding away from the past, she had been standing still, carrying it. "I didn't write to bring you back," she continued. "Not to stay. I just needed to know you were alive, that you remembered." "I remembered," he said quickly. "Every day." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if measuring the truth of his words. After a moment she nodded. "I believed you would come," she said softly. "Not because of what we were, but because of who you are." The words settled deep inside him. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the walls of the house. The lantern flame danced. "I don't know what happens now," he said. "I don't either," she replied. "But tonight was never about answers. It was about facing what we left behind," he realized. She smiled, a sad but peaceful smile. "Yes." They sat together as the night deepened, sharing small stories, careful words, and long pauses. There was no rush. No need to pretend they were anything other than 2 people shaped by time, finally standing on the same ground again. And for the first time in many years, he did not feel like running. The night grew quieter as time passed, but neither of them noticed how long they had been sitting there. The lantern burned low, its light softer now, as if it too was growing tired. Outside, the wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the same sound it always had. Some things truly had not changed. He leaned back slightly in his chair, holding the cup in both hands, though the water inside had long gone cold. His eyes moved around the room again, taking in the small details he had missed before. A folded blanket on a chair, a pair of worn boots near the door, a few simple tools resting by the wall. This was not a place built for show. It was built for living. "You stayed here alone?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Not always. Life doesn't let you stay alone forever, even when you want to." He nodded, understanding more than she said. Life had pulled him along roads he never planned to travel. He knew it had done the same to her. "I left for a few years after that night," she continued. I went east, stayed with distant family. I thought distance would help me forget. Did it? He asked. No, she said honestly. It only taught me that some memories travel with you. Her words settled between them, gentle but firm. He looked down at his hands. They were rough now, scarred by work and time. These hands once held a boy's dreams. Now they held the weight of many years. I wanted to come back sooner, he said suddenly, surprising even himself. I told myself I would. Every year I said next year. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened. But years have a way of closing in on you, he went on. One turns into 5, 5 into 10. Then one day you wake up and realize the road back feels longer than the road ahead. She nodded slowly. I know that feeling. He met her eyes. I didn't know if you'd want to see me. I didn't know either, she admitted. That's why I waited. For what? For the right time, she said. Or maybe for the right version of us. The thought stayed with him. He wondered which version of himself had arrived at her door tonight. The boy who left in fear, or the man shaped by regret. The lantern flickered again. She stood and adjusted it, adding a little oil before sitting back down. The simple action felt familiar, like watching someone finish a sentence you already know. Do you remember the old tree near the fence? She asked. He smiled faintly. The one struck by lightning. Yes, you swore it was cursed. And you said it was lucky, he replied. Because it survived, she said, even after being hit. He chuckled softly. You always saw things differently. That's why we worked, she said, then paused as if unsure she should have said that. The words hung in the air, not painful, just honest. They talked about small things then, about the weather, about nearby towns, about people they both once knew. Some names brought smiles, others brought silence. They avoided the sharpest memories, circling around them like cautious travelers. At one point he stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the moon had moved higher, painting the land in silver. The prairie stretched endlessly, just as it always had. Wide, open, unforgiving. I used to think leaving meant freedom, he said, still looking outside. But I learned freedom isn't always about distance. She joined him at the window, standing beside him with just enough space to keep things safe. And I thought staying meant being trapped, she said. But I learned roots can be strength. They stood there together, not touching, yet closer than they had been in years. He turned to her. Why now? He asked gently. Why write to me after all this time? She took a slow breath. Because I'm tired of carrying questions alone. He understood that too. Some questions grow heavier with age. I didn't bring you here to change your life, she added, or to change mine. Then what? He asked. To finally speak the truth, she said, even if it's late. He nodded. Late is still better than never. They returned to their seats, and she told him about the years he missed. How she worked the land. How she rebuilt with help from neighbors. How there were moments she nearly gave up, and moments she felt proud of surviving another season. He listened carefully, not interrupting, letting her story take its full shape. This was her life, not just a chapter connected to his. When she finished, he spoke about his own road, the places he traveled, the people he met and lost. The nights he spent under open skies, wondering if he had chosen the wrong path. You seem calmer, she said after a while. I'm tired, he replied with a small smile, tired enough to stop running. That earned a quiet laugh from her. I always knew you'd slow down someday. He looked at her seriously. I don't know what tomorrow looks like. Neither do I, she said, but tonight mattered. Yes, he agreed. It did. The fire outside cracked softly as the wind shifted again. The lantern was nearly out now, the room resting in shadows. They sat there until the silence felt complete, not empty. Finally, he stood. I should go before it gets too late. She rose as well. I knew you would. They walked to the door together. Outside, the night greeted them with cool air and quiet stars. His horse waited patiently, as if it too understood the importance of this meeting. He turned to her. Thank you, he said. For coming, she replied. They stood facing each other, both aware that this moment would stay with them long after the night ended. He tipped his hat, a small, respectful gesture. "Take care," he said. "You too, cowboy," she answered, using the old name one last time. As he mounted his horse and rode away, he did not feel the usual weight in his chest. Instead, there was a strange sense of peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because something important had finally been faced. Behind him, the light at the house dimmed, then went out. Ahead of him, the road stretched on. And for the first time, he rode forward without looking back in fear, knowing the past no longer had power over him. It had already spoken. The morning came slowly, carried in on a pale line of light across the prairie. The woman stood at the window long after the cowboy had ridden away, her hands resting on the wooden sill. The night felt unfinished, like a sentence that ended without a period. She did not feel sad, not exactly. What she felt was something deeper, relief mixed with truth. For years she had imagined that moment. Sometimes she pictured him younger, riding back with a smile, ready to reclaim what they lost. Other times she imagined an older man, tired and distant, barely remembering her name. The man who came last night was neither of those. He was real, and somehow that mattered more than the dream. She turned away from the window and began her day. Life did not stop just because the past had come knocking. She swept the floor, fed the animals, and prepared a simple meal. These routines grounded her. They reminded her that she had built this life with her own hands. The land outside was quiet but not empty. Every fence post, every patch of soil carried the mark of her effort. As the sun rose higher, her thoughts returned to the night before, not in sharp flashes but in steady waves. She remembered the years after he left. At first there was shock, then anger, then silence. The world had moved on without waiting for her to catch her breath. People talked about rebuilding, about finding new places, new chances. She listened, nodded, and did what she had to do. She learned quickly that waiting for answers did not feed you or keep you warm. There were days she felt strong. Other days, the loneliness pressed down hard. She worked through it all. When others left, she stayed. When storms came, she endured them. And slowly the land accepted her again. She had rebuilt not just a house, but herself. That was why she had written the letter, not from need, but from readiness. She no longer wondered who she would be without him. She knew. She was simply ready to know who he had become. By mid-morning, she stepped outside and walked toward the far edge of the property. There, near the old fence line, stood what remained of the tree they once argued about as children. It was scarred, bent, but alive. New branches had grown where old ones broke. She rested her hand against its rough bark. "Still standing," she murmured. The cowboy, meanwhile, rode beneath the rising sun, his path stretching ahead. He had not gone far when he stopped and looked back once, just once, at the land behind him. He did not regret leaving this time. The heaviness he carried for decades felt lighter, as if speaking the truth had loosened its grip. As he rode, he thought about her words, about strength, about roots. He had always believed survival meant movement. But now he wondered if survival also meant facing what you left behind. By the time he reached the edge of town, the world felt sharper, clearer. People passed him, unaware that something inside him had shifted. He tied his horse and sat outside the general store, watching the day begin. For the first time in years, he was not in a hurry. Back at the house, the woman sat at the table with a piece of paper in front of her. She did not plan to write another letter. There was nothing left to say that needed ink. Still, she found comfort in the blank page. It reminded her that the story was not finished. It had simply turned a page. She thought of all the years she had carried the truth alone. The truth that he had not abandoned her out of cruelty. The truth that staying had been her choice, not her punishment. The truth that love could exist without possession. That night had not been about bringing him back. It had been about releasing something she had held too tightly. As the day moved on, a neighbor stopped by to check the fence. They spoke casually, laughed about small things. Life continued just as it always did. But beneath the ordinary moments was a quiet shift, like the land after a long drought finally receiving rain. That evening, she lit the lantern again, not because she expected someone to arrive, but because she liked the way the light filled the room. She sat with a cup of tea and let the silence settle naturally. There was no ache in it now. Miles away, the cowboy lay beneath the open sky, his bedroll spread out beside his horse. The stars were bright, familiar companions. He stared up at them and thought about the boy he once was. He did not judge that boy anymore. Fear had shaped him, yes, but so had hope. He realized then that he did not need forgiveness from the past. He had already given it to himself. As the fire burned low, his thoughts drifted to her, not as a lost love but as a steady presence in his life story. Someone who knew his beginning and now understood his middle. That was enough. Morning came again, just as it always does. She woke with purpose. He woke with peace. They would walk separate paths, but neither felt alone anymore. The past had finally been spoken aloud, and in doing so it had lost its power to wound. What remained was respect, memory, and the quiet strength of two lives fully lived. And somewhere between the land they shared and the roads they chose, something rare had happened. Not a reunion, not a farewell, but understanding. And sometimes that is the most honest ending of all. The days that followed were quiet, but they were not empty. The woman continued her life on the land, waking early, working until the sun dipped low, and resting when the stars appeared. At first, she thought the memory of that night would fade quickly, like a dream that loses shape after morning comes. But it didn't fade. Instead, it settled into her life in a calm, steady way, no longer sharp or heavy. She found herself breathing easier. For many years, she had carried a question deep inside her, even when she told herself she was fine. That question had followed her through seasons of hard work and long winters. Now it was finally answered, not with perfect words but with honesty. And honesty, she realized, was enough. She no longer wondered what might have been. She focused on what was. One afternoon, as she repaired a loose fence post, she noticed how strong her hands had become over the years. These were not the hands of the girl who once dreamed by the porch. These were the hands of someone who had endured storms, loss, and long nights of doubt and still stood. She smiled to herself. That evening she sat on the porch, watching the sky turn orange and gold, the same sky she had watched as a child. Back then she had dreamed of faraway places. Now she understood something important. Peace does not always live far away. Sometimes it grows quietly where you choose to stay. Far down the road, the cowboy continued his journey. He rode without urgency, allowing the days to move at their own pace. For once, he was not chasing the horizon or running from silence. Each night he rested beneath the stars, and each morning he woke with a clearer mind. The past no longer whispered accusations. It spoke calmly now, like an old friend reminding him where he began. He thought often about the woman, but not with pain. He thought of her strength, her steadiness, and the way she looked at him, not with blame but understanding. That look stayed with him more than anything else. He realized something important during those quiet rides. He had spent most of his life believing that leaving was the only way to survive, but survival had cost him connection. Now he understood that leaving had been one chapter, not the whole story. At a small town several days later, he stopped longer than usual. He helped a farmer mend a broken wagon. He shared a meal with strangers who soon felt like friends. For the first time, he allowed himself to stay without feeling trapped. He was learning how to live differently. Back at the homestead, the woman received a letter from a distant cousin inviting her to visit. She read it carefully, then set it aside. She did not rush to answer. She had learned that not every invitation required an immediate response. Some things deserved time. She walked outside and looked across the land she had protected for so long. This place no longer held ghosts. It held life. Weeks passed. The cowboy returned to the region once more, not to her house, but nearby. He did not plan to see her again, and yet he did not fear the thought either. The urgency was gone. Whatever needed to be said between them had already been spoken. One evening, as the sun fell low, he stood on a rise overlooking the prairie. He took off his hat and let the wind brush through his hair. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: gratitude. Gratitude for the boy who dreamed. Gratitude for the man who survived. Gratitude for the woman who waited not for him but for truth. Back at the house, the woman lit the lantern one last time that season and placed it by the window. Not as a signal, not as an invitation, but as a symbol. Light did not always mean calling someone back. Sometimes it meant honoring what had been. She whispered softly, "Thank you," though she was not sure to whom, perhaps to the past, perhaps to herself. As winter approached, both lives moved forward in their own way. There were no dramatic reunions, no promises made under the stars, and yet something meaningful had occurred. Two people had faced their shared history. They had spoken without anger. They had listened without defense. They had let go without regret. And in doing so, they found peace. Years later, when the land had changed again and time had softened every sharp edge, the story remained, not as a tale of loss, but as one of understanding, of how love does not always ask to be reclaimed. Sometimes it asks only to be acknowledged. And that acknowledgement can be enough to set a life free. The prairie continued to stretch wide beneath the sky, just as it always had. And somewhere within that vastness, two lives carried forward, whole, honest, and finally at rest with their past.